Right-wing populist leader Viktor Orbán has just suffered a historic defeat in the Hungarian elections overnight. Hi, my name is Benjamin Clark, and you're with me for this bonus episode of the Prospect Podcast, and I'm joined by Michael Ignatieff. We're recording this at around midday on the 13th of April, and it was a massive upset victory for the TISA party against Viktor Orbán's Fidesz. Now, Michael, you're an author, academic, former Canadian politician, and you've also spent a lot of time in Hungary, and you wrote an article for our latest edition at Prospect on why you thought that this election would determine the fate of the West. But before we get into that, let's just set the scene for our viewers. Who are the main players here? So who is the now outgoing leader of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, and who is his opponent, the now incoming leader, Péter Magyar?
Well, Viktor Orbán is a illiberal authoritarian leader who ruled Hungary for 16 years. He's actually been prime minister of Hungary for 20 years because he was elected at the early age of 35, I think, in the late 90s, led Hungary into NATO and the EU, and then turned sharply rightwards and then ruled uninterruptedly, but with increasing corruption until he was defeated last night. His opponent, Péter Magyar, was a 45-year-old ex-member of Orbán's own party who broke from the Fidesz establishment and then 2 years ago and set out to create an alternative movement to defeat Orbán, and worked for 2 years up and down the country campaigning, and has pulled off an extraordinary upset which destroyed all the existing opposition parties, just wiped they effectively disappeared, and created a two-party system in which he has now a constitutional majority, means a 2/3 majority, so he can have great power in the new incoming administration, and faces a much diminished Fidesz party, which has been reduced by half of its size. So it's an astonishing upset. People predicted it, but closer observers and people like me who've been in and out of the country just didn't believe it was possible, and it happened. So it's an amazing time, an amazing moment in European politics.
If people didn't know a lot about Hungarian politics, but they went on Blue Sky, for instance, or read The Guardian today, that they might be a bit surprised at how significant this national election of a fairly small European country is being treated. In your essay for Prospect, you suggested that this election would determine the fate of the West, which, is a big, significant claim for what is a small country. So perhaps, for those who might not know a lot about, what Orbán has been doing over the last 16 years, why is it so significant?
Well, I know Hungarians, I've married one, so I think I can get away with saying this. Hungarians can be a little bit megalomaniac. They are a very small country that has punched way above its weight for centuries, and it's given the world some fantastic scientists and artists and writers and musicians. But this is the first time I think its political system has produced an effect that is European-wide. And that's because Orbán not only took power in Hungary, but he decided he wanted to export his model of illiberal democracy, that is majoritarian single-party rule, with all the checks and balances of liberal democracy stripped out. He wanted to say to Europe and to the world, this is the future. This is the future of democracy. That is a super centralized executive, no checks and balances. This is the future, and it represents the people's will. That was the thing. It's legitimate because it uses popular support as its base. And he believed that this would sweep Europe, and for a time, places like France with the National Rally and Jordan Bardella, for a time, the Netherlands, right-wing party there, AfD, the right-wing party in Germany, and crucially, the Maga movement in the United States all trooped to Budapest because he seemed to have a formula that everybody wanted to borrow. Not just the model of a liberal democracy, but this relentless 24/7 attack on liberalism, by which he meant societies that are open to immigration, by which he meant societies that endorse sexual freedom, including the rights of trans people, the kind of supposed permissiveness of liberalism, its secularism, its supposed hostility to religion, etc. As an old liberal, I have to say this is a caricature of what liberalism actually is, but he took the caricature and made it into a kind of global enemy that he directed all his blows against. And he also, crucially and very rarely for a head of a small country, invested massively in think tanks, research centers, a thing called Corvinus Collegium, which was massively funded, attracted intellectuals from across Europe and North America of a conservative character, and it essentially made himself not only the head of a government, but the head of an intellectual movement across the world. And it's that now that has been stopped in its tracks because his credibility depended on his political success, and he's just been massively defeated on his home terrain. And so the future status of this intellectual project is now open to question and up for grabs.
Yeah, totally. And some viewers might be aware of certain British commentators who've gone over and had a nice holiday on the Danube with the support of the Hungarian government in recent years. It's a sort of a common story on the right at the minute. But I guess as well as supporting conservative intellectuals who might have been supportive of the government through these various ventures, they also sort of cracked down on dissenting voices at home. And I wonder if you could speak to your personal experience of, you held a job at the university in Budapest, and that university came under fire from the government. You're no longer living in Budapest, though you're back there at the moment for the election. Yeah, would be interested to hear you speak to your personal experience of this in Hungary.
Well, just so your listeners have the background, I'm a Canadian who was teaching at Harvard and was chosen to become rector and president of a thing called Central European University, which was a small graduate school in the humanities and social sciences, founded in 1991 by George Soros, the multi-billionaire hedge fund owner, together with a bunch of Hungarian intellectuals, to set up an institution that would be a free university in a society transitioning out of communism. And the sensible idea was that you can't have democracy unless you have free institutions, especially free universities. And in the 30 years it was in Budapest, it established itself as a pretty serious academic institution. It wasn't, a liberal organizing unit promoting, intervening in Hungarian politics. It was an academic institution with a good academic reputation, and that's why I took the job. My wife is also Hungarian. That was another reason why I took the job. We thought we had worked out a modus vivendi with Viktor Orbán in Budapest. He didn't like us, but he let us be. And then suddenly he realized that he had an election coming up in 2018, and he decided to make George Soros public enemy number one. It's important to note that illiberal authoritarians like Orbán, like President Trump, depend on creating enemies. You use enemies to rouse and create your base. You create a hate figure, direct all of your target at that, drives up commitment by your base vote, and that's how you win elections. So he chose Soros as his chief enemy, and the prize symbol of Soros's presence in Hungary was Central European University. So he rammed legislation through his parliament, where he had a 2/3 majority, essentially rendering us illegal. I won't go into the details, but what he did was a flagrant violation of European law, as the European Court of Justice was defined. But we fought this law, which was called Lex CU, garnered enormous amounts of support from, British institutions, European institutions, American institutions, all to no avail. And eventually we were forced to withdraw from Hungary and reestablish ourselves across the border 2.5 hours away in Vienna, where we have been ever since. And we survived, and we're fine, and we're accepting students, and anybody listening to this broadcast who wants to come to Vienna and have a great education, come to CU. So we survived. Don't cry for us, Argentina. We did fine. But the important thing was that we were the first example of an illiberal authoritarian regime attacking a university. And that set the pattern, and JD Vance and other people have acknowledged it. Orbán set the pattern for what the Trump administration then did when it got into power in the United States in 2025. It immediately launched an attack on the Ivy League, and its battle with Harvard, my alma mater, is still continuing. So we were important. The CEU story was important because it kind of provided the template for an illiberal authoritarian attack on academic freedom in general. And I think hopefully Orbán's defeat last night puts an end to that kind of politics, because it's poison. I mean, it's just poison. I'm a university guy, so I would say that, wouldn't I? But any government that attacks universities ends up inflicting incalculable damage on its own society. So I'm glad to see the end of that period of attack, and I'm hoping, in fact, that what happened to Orbán will possibly act as a restraint on what President Trump still seems to be trying to do in American universities.
Yeah, so perhaps if we can drill down a bit more on the results now. So as you mentioned at the top, the TISA party led by Magyar has, at the moment, with I think it's about 98, 99% of the vote counted, it looks like it is on track for a supermajority. How significant is that majority, and what could they do? What, implications could there be for Hungarian society?
Well, under Hungarian law, if you have a supermajority in the parliament, you can alter the constitution, and it gives you the power to renew or change the composition of the Supreme Court. It gives you the possibility to alter the electoral system. It gives you enormous power to change the rules of the democratic game. And Orbán used his supermajority to gerrymander the democratic system to favor Fidesz, and he stripped the Constitutional Court of any power to obstruct his authority. And one of the tests here of whether Magyar is a genuine Democrat is whether he restores the independence of the Supreme Court, whether he restores the independence of all the regulatory bodies that a modern state has to have. For example, the bodies that certify universities. I mean, you want to have independent bodies doing that, as opposed to bodies that are controlled by the government. So he needs to, if he wants to give proof that he's a real Democrat, he has to restore the institution of these bodies, and he will need a constitutional majority to do that. He has last night said, I want all the judges appointed by Fidesz just resign, please, because I can't keep you in your post. And he said the same thing to the president, and also a political appointee of Fidesz. So he's put down markers immediately that he wants to use this authority to restore liberal constitutional order in Hungary, and we'll have to see whether he does it. And another thing that he will want to do is restore honest, open, impartial journalism to the publicly owned, state-owned media. My wife was just telling me that she tuned on the main television channel, and for the first time in 16 years, they were kind of reporting news in a relatively fair manner. So that's a revolution if that's continued. What would be terrible is if Magyar gets power and then begins to exercise power in the same arbitrary way as Mr. Orbán. But I'm hoping that the nearly 3.5 million Hungarians who voted for him won't allow him to do that, because he is accountable to them. One of the fundamental things he's promised, and we'll see whether he abides by it, is to give himself term limits. That is, give everybody term limits, so that he's saying now, I will serve 2 terms if reelected as Prime Minister of Hungary, but I will not seek a further mandate, because I think he understands that term limits are there to prevent corruption, prevent people becoming so enamored of power that they do anything to stay in power. And if he keeps to that term limit proposal, I think that will be good for Hungarian democracy. I mean, the wider context here is that these are societies coming out of 80 years of communism. Hungary does not have deep democratic traditions. Even before the communists took over in 1948, it had authoritarian political traditions. So it's almost as if with the victory last night, they're starting the clock again in the transition to regular democracy. And if they succeed, that's enormously important for Europe. One of the reasons that Orbán made life so difficult for the European Union was that he was in a club of Democrats and wasn't a Democrat. As soon as you really restored an anchored democracy in Hungary, it really then requires the prime minister in his dealings with the EU to behave democratically, and to go with the democratic current of the European Union. And if that happens, I think it will strengthen Europe, and so that would be good. But all of this depends whether he actually does what he promised. I mean, we don't know, and I'm delighted he won, but I think now the job of anybody who's sympathetic to him is to hold him to his promises.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess what is that feeling on the ground? I've seen scenes of elation online. How did it feel to be out on the streets? And as you say, your wife is Hungarian. You'd be speaking to a lot of Hungarians. What's the sort of feeling at the moment? I guess on the one hand, there must be a lot of excitement, but at the same time, as you said, there's potentially, this is a new era for Hungary. Perhaps some trepidation there about, what the future will bring.
Well, truth be told, I married a small town girl, and we're in her small town. It's where she grew up, and we've been there for a long time and have a little place. And so her neighbors, her family have been phoning her. We went to the voting booth, which is just down the road, yesterday, and watched people queuing up. That's another fact about this election was kind of pretty moving to see, is that it was the highest turnout for a Hungarian election since whenever. I mean, it was close to 80% of the public turned out, and you could see that at the polling booth. The queues were long and persistent, and even members of her own family who don't usually vote actually, got out of bed and showed up. So that was great. And then all evening we've been having calls from her friends saying how excited they are, and a certain amount of champagne was drunk. And I think the other interesting phenomenon is just how many messages and emails and phone messages we had from our friends outside of Hungary. This is an event that's had resonance kind of in lots of other places. I mean, I must have had 15 emails from Americans saying, "Wow, isn't this great? And doesn't this promise that we'll get rid of Mr. Trump?" And all that. I have no idea whether it have any effect on American politics, but it's a nice feeling to feel that something happening in a small country in Eastern Europe has this effect around the world.
So your essay that you wrote for Prospect was, pitching this as sort of very significant for Europe and for the West more generally. I'd like to do a sort of, rapid fire round, perhaps, of me naming some key players here and seeing, how you think they will interpret the
Sure.
results of the election and how it might change their political calculus going forward. So if we start with Europe.
I think Magyar's victory will have an immediate impact on one crucial issue, which is European support of Ukraine. Orban was holding up the $90 billion of budget support that the EU had promised Ukraine. He was holding it up because let's forget why he was holding it up. He was holding it up basically to keep Putin happy. So I think this will strengthen Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion. I think it will strengthen Europe's capacity to assist Ukraine. I think it is a blow to Putin. Putin tried to intervene in the Hungarian election, as did the Americans. Secretary of State Rubio, Vice President Vance showed up here trying to affect the election. And I noticed when I went to a rally with Magyar in my wife's hometown late last week, one of the biggest applause lines came when he said, "Look, this election is going to be decided by Hungarians, not by anybody else." And in other words, I think the external influence or attempt to influence by the United States and by Russia failed completely. In fact, had a negative effect. So that's that side of things. Whether it has an effect on American domestic politics, I doubt very much. Will it have an effect on France? Possible. The links between Orban and the National Rally were very close. Orban facilitated a loan from a Hungarian bank to the Le Pen, the right-wing challenger to the presidency in 2027. So I think that's at the very least discouraging in France. The same could be also said about the AfD, the far-right party in Germany. I think there has been Magyar's victory last night is discouraging to the far-right tendencies right across Europe. So that's where I would go there. But again, if all politics is local, as a famous American politician said, then we got to be careful about extrapolation. The point of my piece was that Orban managed to turn his reign in a small Eastern European country into a symbol of where he thought the West should go. Well, I don't think the West is necessarily going to go in that direction now that he's been defeated. That's about as far as I would go. I wouldn't want to overstate it. And as for Britain, Farage is his own guy, very, very close to Trump, but much less closely aligned with figures like Orban. So, and I think Farage will be at pains to differentiate himself from Trump, and he'll be at pains to differentiate himself from further to the right in Europe, and insist that he's a sui generis, homegrown, entirely British product. And then the British public will have to decide what they do about that.
Yes, they will. I guess not moving to Britain quite yet, but speaking to the US, you mentioned JD Vance there, and his intervention in the Hungarian election campaign was obviously seen as quite significant. It was quite a quite a step for a sitting US vice president to go and campaign with a party in, as we've said, a small nation in Europe.
Well,
How do you think that the MAGA crowd is going to interpret the results of this election, interpret the perceived failure of Vance's intervention, and what it might mean for the MAGA project, both at home in the US, but also in terms of their foreign policy at the moment?
well, one feature of the Orban project was to invite a very large number of American right-wing intellectuals, scholars, whatever, to Budapest for very cushy and substantially funded visits to Budapest. And I think that's going to dry up. I mean, I just think Orban's unquestionably considerable intellectual influence on Maga is simply bound to decline. The influence was conditional on his political power, and absent political power, it will diminish. But there's no question there is a substantial far right, extreme conservative attack on what I believe in, which is liberalism, and that I'm sure will continue. I don't think it began, with Edmund Burke attacking the French Revolution, and it's going to go on into the indefinite future. This argument between conservatives and liberals is an eternal and good feature of politics everywhere. So that'll go on. But I think the thing that Orban's defeat will possibly drive home to conservatives is that there's a big distinction between constitutional conservatism, which respects checks and balances, and this extra constitutional conservatism of Orban. Orban is basically, I think, not constitutional and not a democrat. Ultimately, he's an authoritarian. Now he he followed the result of election defeat. Good for him. That's entirely to his credit. But the constitution he was prepared to respect was only the constitution that he himself had written, and having written the rules, he then he felt obliged to follow them. But basically, the challenge of 21st century conservatism is that it's at the very edge of the constitutional order. It bears no relation to the conservatism that liberals have been arguing with for 200 years. It's essentially an apologia for executive authoritarianism of the kind that Trump is attempting to, impose on, the American Constitution, and hopefully will fail to do so. But he's certainly going to try. And that project is really dangerous for democracy. I mean, I've got all the time in the world for a constitutional conservative. We disagree about everything, but we play by the same rules. You know what I mean? I mean, I respect the Constitution. He or she respects the Constitution. Then we argue about very important and fundamental and unbridgeable divides, but within the framework of constitutional order. This new kind of conservatism is essentially non-constitutional, anti-constitutional, and possibly aids and abets, and could aid and abet political violence. And so, and the example I mean there, lest I seem to be throwing wild accusations around, Trump's refusal to condemn the invasion of Congress on January 6, 2021 was abetting political violence. That's what I mean. I only mean that.
Yeah, so speaking of authoritarian dangers to democracy, Vladimir Putin, he and Orban were increasingly close across Orban's time as leader, and Orban often acted as an effective deputy for him in the EU and sort of advancing some of his interests in terms of blocking assistance to Ukraine, for instance. So how do you think that Putin is going to be interpreting the results of the election, and how might it change his actions and the actions of the Russian state going forward?
Putin is a ruthless guy. I think he simply thinks Hungary is a little country. I don't care. I mean, he waves it away. His authoritarianism is so consolidated, so ruthless, so violent, so violative of the international order that he's beyond any correction other than actual military defeat. The only thing that will stop him is military defeat or being forced by a competing hegemon, i.e., the United States, to stop this, horrendous invasion and violation of the sovereignty of a European state. So I don't think he cares about Orban. I think he doesn't see things in that way. I think he's like all these hegemons. He's a great power guy. He thinks there are only three people that I care about. One is China, one is Washington, one is Trump, and one is me. And the rest of them are just bit players. I don't care about Britain. What? Who cares about that? What? This is how these guys think, and so we just they'll have to be proven wrong, won't they?
Yeah, you mean to suggest, Michael, that Britain's not a great world player anymore?
I'm sorry to break this news to you. I know it's a shock. You'll have to get used to it.
Magazine, it breaks our heart, but it may be true. Your Central European University colleague, Zuzana Zelenyi, she wrote in The Guardian today that removing Orban from office is one thing, dismantling Orbanism is quite another. Fidesz has entrenched itself within, many Hungarian institutions. They have many power bases across Hungarian society. Is it well positioned now to regroup and bounce back? And might the example of Poland, for instance, be instructive here, where there was an authoritarian government that was removed from power, but it retained influence, and now the country seems to be sliding back towards their brand of right-wing populism?
Well, it's significant that Magyar announced that his first visit overseas will be to Poland, and that can't be. There must be a connection. I mean, I think he will go and talk to Tusk and say, I have to dismantle an authoritarian regime. You had to dismantle an authoritarian regime. What can I learn from you? I think there'll be a lot of that. I think Zsuzsa Zelenyi is entirely right. Dismantling the system will take a long time. Magyar estimated that there were 3,000 members of the Fidesz team who were dug into positions as bureaucrats, judges, contractors, suppliers, factotums. All of them dug into a quite structured system of corruption. The mayor of the town where I spend a lot of my time is Mr. 10%, and everybody knows what that means. So the corruption is systemic, not occasional, and getting rid of it will be difficult. But he does have a 2/3 constitutional majority. It gives him quite a lot of power over appointments. It gives him the power to change the laws, and Fidesz will resist. It's appropriate that Fidesz becomes an effective opposition. This government needs an effective opposition like any government does. But there is some risk that Fidesz will begin to fracture and split. There's even some risk that TISA will fracture and split. Exercising power is a very difficult thing. And the crucial issue, I think, is the economy. I mean, the hard fact is that people joined the European Union in 2004, whenever it was, with the promise that their standard of living would converge with nearby Austria. 16 years on, the gap is as wide as ever, if not wider. And that economic problem is, Magyar has got to make progress in that area, or he's going to be in trouble. And so if he spends too much time trying to root out the corruption of Fidesz, he'll be dealing with the past as opposed to the future. And the problem of the future is, what is the future of the Hungarian economy? So that's the kind of balance that he's going to. It's not merely that it's difficult to uproot the system of corruption. It's also that if you spend your time doing nothing but that, you neglect the other things that are on voters' minds.
Yeah, and so perhaps to draw things to a close here, Michael, I'd like to kind of zoom out and think about liberalism. Liberalism is the sort of undergirding theme of your story on Hungary, but also you've written about liberalism for us at Prospect before. The prospects of liberalism around the world at the moment as it faces many threats. But looking around the world at the moment, you've got Trump doing a lot of worrying things in the US. You used to be the leader of the Canadian Liberal Party for a time. One of your subsequent successors, Mark Carney, is sort of putting his stamp on what a sort of 21st century liberalism standing up to Trumpism might look like. What other examples around the world are you looking at the moment for, places where illiberalism is being effectively combated? What are some of the other green shoots that, while we're all feeling a little bit hopeful for, for at least 24, 48 hours, what are some other spots of hope around the world that you're taking inspiration from at the moment?
I don't know that I can identify particular places. I mean, some of the places that are in great shape or have always been in great shape: Finland, Sweden, Norway. I was up in the Baltic states recently, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. These are remarkable success stories. I mean, the gloom that spreads across Europe about how weak and feeble European democracy is just seems false if you if you start up north. Spain, I'm in Spain all the time. It's growing at 3-4% at the moment. It's got a socialist government that I often disagree with, but what's not to like about Spain at the moment? Portugal, similar story. I mean, there are lots of the places that are worrying are frankly Great Britain. And what's worrying about Britain is simply an economic performance that is not delivering the growth that the country needs to sustain the commitments that it's made in healthcare and social protection. It's just not, but on the other hand, I'm old enough to remember, and this will be an unfashionable comparison. I'm old enough to remember the Thatcher Revolution, and brutal as it was, it taught me that you really underestimate Great Britain at your peril. I mean, if you get decisive leadership, even if some of what she did was horrible, you can get very substantial growth in Britain. Some of Britain's problems now are the heritage of Mrs. Thatcher's mistakes, I acknowledge. But Britain, I wouldn't say is the sick man of Europe, but it's a place where the democratic experiment is having terrific difficulty at the moment. Productivity, over centralization, all these things. I could go on. So Britain would be one, France is another place where the same kind of problem. If you have a country where you can't pass a budget and cannot get a society to accept retirement at 64, you are looking at a democracy that is not functioning. So the global picture is that democracy is actually doing pretty well in a lot of places in Europe and is in real trouble in a couple. I think in Britain and in France. So.
Yeah, okay. So I guess final question would be, I guess one of the themes that came out there was leaders at the moment seem to be able to come from opposition and win when there's some economic discontent in society, and there are some leaders on the liberal side and some on the illiberal side who are exploiting that. You could say that Magyar effectively brought out people's economic discontent with the government, the lack of growth, the lack of wages going ahead, etc. You could also say that Farage, whilst he's speaking often to concerns around migration and social issues and that kind of thing, that he is playing on people's upset feelings around, the lack of growth, broken Britain, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, if you could give any advice to any political leaders right now, who are incumbents like Keir Starmer, who, are trying to overcome this cycle of, people get upset with the economy and then they change leader, and then they get upset with the economy and they change leader. What advice would you give to someone like Starmer at the moment?
Well, honesty requires me to say I'm in no position to give any leader any advice, since my experience of leadership wasn't fantastically successful in Canada. Success often depends on stuff that's absolutely out of your control. Mark Carney declared himself as a candidate for the Liberal leadership of the party I used to lead, and the party was 20 points back in the poll, and then Trump attacked the country, and he is now almost within sight of a majority. So, as Harold Macmillan said, what's the problem in politics? It's events, dear boy, dear events. And so I just don't know. The one thing you can see, that everybody can see with Starmer and other leaders, is that the minute you reverse yourself, you pay a price. The only way to lead ever is to keep it simple. Choose 2 objectives, or 3, no more than 3, and do them. And do them through hell and high water, and get them done. That's all that matters. Everything else is just window dressing. I mean, he's not the most personable guy in the world. He's this and that. Doesn't matter. What matters is that people know that he will stick at something and go at it till he gets it done. That's the only trick to leadership, it seems to me. And Magyar is an example of someone who stuck for 2 years at one job, which was to convince his fellow citizens that Orbán had to go, and he succeeded. And that's leadership. That's what it is.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Michael. Viewers should check out Michael's essay for the most recent edition of Prospect on Hungary as the example of counter-revolution in Europe at the moment. Thanks very much for your time, Michael.
Pleasure. Thank you.